Section 1. Introduction and the weight of expectation. The morning of June 6, 1944, didn't announce itself with fanfare for the men defending the Normandy coast. It came instead with the kind of weather that made everyone assume nothing significant could possibly happen. Dark skies hung low over the English Channel, the wind whipped the waters into angry grey caps, and visibility was so poor that it seemed almost laughable to worry about invasion. The meteorologists had already assured the High Command that the storm would persist for at least 2 more weeks. Most German commanders, lulled by this forecast and the miserable conditions they could see with their own eyes, had actually left their posts. Some were attending war games. Others were visiting family. Still others were asleep, trusting that no competent military force would attempt an amphibious landing in such conditions. This confidence would prove to be catastrophically misplaced. But before we explore the shock and horror of June 6, we need to understand what the Germans thought they had built and what they believed would protect them. For nearly 2 years, Nazi Germany had poured enormous resources into what they called the Atlantic Wall, a supposedly impregnable fortress that stretched over 2,000 miles from Norway to the Spanish border. It was propaganda, certainly, but it was also a real engineering achievement that represented millions upon millions of tons of concrete, steel, and human labor. The wall was supposed to be the answer to German nightmares of invasion, the physical manifestation of Hitler's promise that any Allied force attempting to land in occupied Europe would be thrown back into the sea within hours. Rommel himself had inspected these positions just days before June 6, looking through gun apertures that overlooked the channel, studying the overlapping fields of fire, nodding with satisfaction. When the invasion came, he had written confidently, this beach would become a cemetery. His engineers had calculated the defensive firepower available in each sector with precise mathematics. They had counted every machine gun position, every artillery battery that could be brought to bear. The numbers looked good. The numbers looked like they should work. But the numbers, as we'll discover, were based on assumptions that the reality of Allied logistics would shatter like glass. The men in the bunkers, young soldiers, some not yet 20, and older veterans who had already seen more combat than most people could imagine, believed they were adequately defended. They'd spent months, in some cases years, training in their positions, learning every inch of the ground in front of them, understanding the interlocking fields of fire that their machine guns could create. Some had been transferred from other fronts to man these positions. Others were conscripts from occupied territories, given German uniforms and told to defend a shore they'd never seen before the war came to their lands. They were tired. They were understaffed. Many of them lacked confidence in their officers. But they had guns, they had bunkers, they had barbed wire, they had mines, and they had something else that was maybe more important. The absolute conviction that if they could just hold the line for a few hours, German reserves would arrive and push the invaders back into the sea. That conviction was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The story of D-Day from the German perspective is not a story of how they might have won or what they should have done differently. It is, instead, a story about the collision between an old way of warfare and a completely new one. It's about what happens when industrial capacity meets military tradition, when logistics defeats tactics, and when a nation that had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months discovers that it is fundamentally unprepared for an opponent with essentially unlimited resources. It's about the shock, the confusion, the growing despair that seized German commanders as they realized that everything they had believed about warfare, about their own superiority, about the weakness of their enemies, had been catastrophically wrong. And it's about the ordinary soldiers who had to face that realization while their world was literally being destroyed around them. Section 2. The Atlantic Wall's promise. If you had asked a German general in early 1944 how confident he was that the Atlantic Wall could stop an invasion, he probably would have expressed considerable optimism. The wall was real. The construction was not merely propaganda, though propaganda certainly surrounded it. Between 1942 and 1944, Germany had genuinely invested an enormous amount of resources into creating a series of fortifications designed to make the English Channel coast as difficult to assault as possible. The sheer scale of the undertaking is difficult to comprehend even now. The wall consumed 17 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build something like 270 Empire State Buildings. It required 1.3 million tons of steel. Think about that for a moment. This was concrete and steel that could have gone into tanks, into ships, into weapons for the Eastern Front where the real battle for Germany's survival was being fought. Yet Hitler had ordered it built anyway, and the mighty organization Todt, Nazi Germany's construction conglomerate, had mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them forcibly conscripted from occupied territory to bring the vision to reality. The wall wasn't a continuous fortification. That was a key misconception, both in German propaganda and in Allied planning assumptions. Instead, it was a system of strong points concentrated at strategically important locations. The Pas-de-Calais region, directly across from Dover and the logical invasion point, received the most attention and the strongest defenses. Hitler believed the Allies would come there because it was the shortest crossing, the closest to Germany, and the most valuable port cities. Thousands of troops were permanently stationed in that region, essentially locked into place by Hitler's conviction that this was where the blow would fall. That conviction would cost them dearly. But Normandy wasn't undefended. It was just less heavily defended than Calais, and it had been strengthened considerably after Field Marshal Owen Rommel arrived in late 1943 to take over the defenses of what became Army Group B. Rommel was a man with a reputation, earned in North Africa fighting the Allies. He understood their tactics, their capabilities, and their strengths. Unlike many German generals who had spent the war fighting in North Africa or Italy, Rommel had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes, American Shermans, and British Crusaders. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. That Allied air superiority was going to be the decisive factor in any invasion. When Rommel arrived and surveyed the defenses, he was appalled. His chief of staff reported that Rommel immediately grasped that the existing defenses were insufficient. There were gaps where the wall was incomplete. Units were understaffed. Many positions lacked adequate supplies. The mindset of some commanders seemed defeatist. Rommel, still commanding respect from Hitler and still believing in the possibility of victory, energetically set about changing this situation. He ordered the construction of new obstacles. He demanded that every possible position be strengthened. He had millions of mines planted, though he wanted more. He introduced the famous Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles set in fields that were supposed to disrupt glider landings. Along the Normandy coast specifically, the Germans had constructed 8 concrete bunkers of various sizes, 35 pillboxes, for artillery positions, 18 anti-tank gun positions, 45 rocket launcher sites, 85 machine gun nests, and 6 mortar pits. At Omaha Beach, where the American assault would take place and where the fighting would be the most vicious, the defenders included the experienced 352nd Infantry Division I unit that hadn't been expected to be there when the Allies made their final invasion plans. The beach itself had been turned into something approximating a killing field. 3,700 obstacles had been planted in the tidal zone. These weren't random obstacles. They were Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, wooden stakes, and anti-tank obstacles, many of them topped with teller mines that would detonate when a landing craft or tank touched them. Behind the beaches, 6.5 million mines had been laid. Rommel had wanted 60 million. The fact that they only had 6.5 million mines tells you something about the scale of the defensive effort and also something about the limitations Germany was facing even before the invasion began. They couldn't produce mines at the rate they wanted. They didn't have enough labor to plant them where they wanted them. The wall, impressive as it was always incomplete, always falling short of what the planners envisioned. The German command structure defending the wall was as complicated as a bureaucratic nightmare. At the top was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who served as Commander-in-Chief West and controlled everything from Norway to the Spanish border. But he didn't control everything equally. Rommel, commanding Army Group B, had a narrow coastal strip stretching from the Zuiderzee to the Loire River and was supposed to handle the primary invasion threat. The problem was that Rommel and Rundstedt disagreed fundamentally about how to defend against an invasion. Rommel wanted to stop the invasion at the beaches. He believed, and this was based on his actual experience fighting the Allies in North Africa, that if the Wehrmacht didn't defeat the invasion on the water or in the first few hours on the beaches, the superior Allied logistics and air power would make defeat inevitable. He argued passionately that the beaches had to be the main line of resistance, that every bunker should have the maximum possible firepower, that the infantry needed to feel supported by armor nearby, and that the Germans had to use their advantage in armor while the Allies were still disorganized and struggling ashore.
Rundstedt believed differently.
He wanted to keep the panzer divisions in reserve, pulled back away from the coast where Allied air power couldn't reach them so easily. He wanted to allow the Allies to land, to commit themselves, and then to hit them with a concentrated counterattack that would drive them back into the sea.
This was the traditional German approach: elastic defense followed by rapid concentration of force and counterattack.
It had worked in North Africa sometimes, and it certainly reflected how defensive operations had been conducted on the Eastern Front. Hitler, characteristically, tried to have it both ways. He kept the final decision on where the panzer divisions would be positioned in his own hands.
He made decisions about armor deployments that satisfied neither Rommel nor Rundstedt and that ultimately left the Germans unable to implement either strategy effectively.
Some panzer divisions were positioned relatively close to the coast, but not close enough to be available in the first hours of the invasion.
Others were held back near Paris.
Still others were scattered along the southern coast, preparing against the possibility of invasion at other locations. The result was a compromise that had the disadvantages of both approaches and the advantages of neither. What made all of this even worse was the command structure itself. The armies that would fight on D-Day reported through a bewildering hierarchy. Orders could come from Berlin, from Rundstedt's headquarters, from Rommel's headquarters, or directly from Hitler himself.
Communication between different units was often slow. Some units lacked the ability to communicate effectively with units nearby.
The Air Force and Navy operated under their own command structures. Coordinating a response to an invasion was going to be difficult under the best of circumstances, but this command structure made it nearly impossible.
The men in the bunkers didn't think much about all this. They thought about their immediate situation.
At the strongpoint WN-62 at Omaha Beach, there was a young soldier named Heinrich Seewar. At least, a young man by that name would later claim that he manned the machine gun position there, though historians debate the details of his claims. In his pocket, he carried a letter from his girlfriend in Germany, promising to wait for him until the war's victorious end. He had written to her just 3 days earlier, repeating the confident assertion that when the Allies came, they would be thrown back into the sea within hours. The field marshal himself had said so. The defenses were strong. The numbers looked good.
How could they possibly lose? Section 3. The meteorological miscalculation. The real story of how the Germans lost on D-Day doesn't begin on the beaches.
It begins with weather forecasts and barometric pressure readings in early June 1944. This might seem like an odd place to start the story of a military invasion, but it's absolutely crucial. Meteorology, in the pre-satellite, pre-computer age, was a primitive business. Forecasters relied on observations from weather stations, ships at sea, and information relayed from various sources.
The more information you had, the better your forecast could be. The less information you had, the more you were essentially guessing.
The Allies had a significant advantage in meteorological data that they had spent years cultivating. They had weather stations in Greenland, weather stations in Iceland, weather stations in Ireland, including in neutral Ireland, where they received data through back-channel agreements. They had weather ships stationed in the Atlantic. They had reconnaissance aircraft that flew out over the ocean recording weather conditions. All of this data was continuously fed to the meteorological team that served Eisenhower. The team was actually quite divided internally about what the weather would do on any given day, but they had the data to make informed arguments about their different positions. The Germans had none of this. They had lost weather stations in the Atlantic and Greenland. They had few ships at sea from which to gather observations. They were relying primarily on weather stations in continental Europe and reports from whatever sources they could access. Crucially, they had broken British radio codes at various points in the war, but by 1944, the situation was more complicated. The Germans were aware that weather information existed, but they often had no way to access it. The Allies, for their part, had broken the German Enigma code and had access to German weather analyses, giving them additional information. By early June 1944, a major storm system was moving across the Atlantic. On June 3 and 4, this storm was clearly going to pass through the English Channel. The weather conditions were absolutely terrible: strong winds, heavy rain, rough seas.
Everyone agreed on this.
The German meteorological team predicted that the storm would persist, and that weather conditions would remain unsuitable for an invasion for at least 10 days to 2 weeks.
This wasn't a guess.
This was a professional forecast based on the data they had available. The chief meteorologist of the 3rd Air Fleet reported that conditions would be so bad that an invasion couldn't be attempted for at least until June 10, and he really expected it would be later than that. Based on this forecast, important people made important decisions. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army that was responsible for defending Normandy, decided to host a war game at Rennes, far from the coast, on June 6.
Senior commanders were ordered to attend. This wasn't some minor exercise.
This was a major tactical exercise involving key officers who would be needed if an invasion actually took place. But the meteorologists had said it wouldn't, so the exercise was planned. Field Marshal Rommel, the senior German commander most actively engaged in the actual work of defending the coast, made a different decision. He had been constantly away from his wife, Lou, for years. June 6 was her 50th birthday. He had even purchased a pair of shoes in Paris to give to her as a gift. The weather was terrible, an invasion seemed impossible, and Hitler himself had indicated that the situation would remain quiet for some time. Why not take a few days of leave, spend her birthday with her, and then meet with Hitler in Berchtesgaden to discuss something he wanted: greater control over the panzer divisions? So on June 5, Rommel left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon and drove toward Germany. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, said goodbye to him and his aide-de-camp, and watched them drive off in his Horchstaff car.
It seemed like a reasonable decision under the circumstances.
Meanwhile, on the Allied side, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, was having a nervous time. He had a team of meteorologists under him, and they were arguing about what was going to happen. Some believed the storm would continue. Others thought they saw signs of a break. Late on June 4, Stagg reported to Eisenhower that there might be a brief window, perhaps just 36 hours, where conditions would be marginally acceptable for an invasion.
They wouldn't be perfect, but they might be good enough.
Eisenhower, facing impossible pressure to launch the invasion, had already postponed it once. Troops were in holding areas, security was at risk, logistics were a nightmare. Made the call to launch on June 6.
He authorized Operation Overlord to proceed.
The massive machine that had been assembled began to move. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the Allies had spotted something the Germans had missed. A single ship, stationed 600 miles west of Ireland, had reported rising barometric pressure. This observation suggested to the Allied meteorologists that a brief ridge of high pressure was moving into the region behind the storm. It would be short-lived.
It might only last for a few hours.
But it would exist. The Germans never received this information. They never detected this ridge.
Their meteorological analysis showed the storm continuing to dominate the weather pattern.
Their forecast was not unreasonable given the data they had. But it was wrong.
Dead wrong.
And this wrong forecast, this single failure in predicting weather, allowed approximately 150,000 men and tens of thousands of tons of equipment to cross the English Channel undetected and reach the coast of France. As the vessels crossed the channel on the night of June 5, the German defenders slept.
In some cases, they weren't even at their posts.
The men at the radar stations detected unusual activity on radar around midnight, but they'd seen false alarms before. Deception raids by the Allies had been designed to confuse exactly this kind of detection. So reports of approaching aircraft came in, but they were treated as routine. By the time anyone realized that this wasn't a deception, that this was actually the invasion, thousands of men were already in landing craft, crossing toward the French coast. Colonel Ernst Goff, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, had calculated earlier that his 4 artillery batteries could theoretically deliver 120 rounds per minute into the beach sectors. Combined with other batteries, the concentrated firepower on any landing attempt should be devastating. These calculations assumed unlimited ammunition and unlimited ability to concentrate fire. They assumed that the bunkers would remain undamaged.
They assumed that the chain of command would function. They assumed that reinforcements would arrive. They assumed many things that were about to prove false. Section 4. Radar reports and initial confusion. The radar contact came in around midnight on June 5. German radar operators working the Freyet and Risberg sets that lined the Norman coast began detecting something unusual. Massive formations approaching from the north. The initial reactions were skeptical. The Allies had been trying to deceive the Germans with false radar returns, with chaff, with dummy paratroopers, with false reports. The operators and their commanders had been on high alert or had been, before everyone relaxed based on the meteorological forecast. Now, as reports came flooding in about aerial formations, the first instinct was disbelief. But the reports wouldn't stop. They kept coming in, and they didn't fit the normal pattern of deception. At 30 minutes past midnight on June 6, reports began to come in that paratroopers were landing. But something was immediately confusing about these reports. Some units reported paratroopers to the east, other units reported them to the west. Some claimed they were British, others said American. The reports were contradictory and confused because the paratroopers themselves were scattered and confused. The cloud cover over Normandy that night was far denser than expected. The special Pathfinder units that were supposed to mark drop zones for the main airborne assault had trouble seeing the ground. Some dropped beacons on the wrong locations. Others dropped them in spots where they couldn't be seen because of the clouds. The pilots of the transport aircraft were trying to fly in formation through clouds, trying to avoid collisions, trying to stay coordinated. It was a nightmare for them, and the result was that paratroopers were scattered across a far wider area than planned. This confusion actually worked in the Germans' favor, at least temporarily. Unable to figure out where the actual airborne landings were taking place, unable to determine the scale of the operation, unable to even understand what was happening, German commanders didn't know what to do. Do you send a division east to stop paratroopers that might be there? Do you keep it in place? Is this the real invasion or a diversion? Are there more paratroopers coming? Is the main assault going to hit somewhere else? Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was one of the first German officers to grasp the situation's gravity. He was awakened by reports of paratroopers landing near his positions. He immediately requested permission to attack. The response he received from division headquarters was essentially, "Don't move until the situation clarifies." This was standard German military procedure. In a fluid situation, you didn't want subordinates taking independent action that might contradict plans made at higher levels. You waited for orders. You coordinated. You moved as a unified force. But for von Luck, this caution was a disaster. He later wrote in his memoir a statement that perfectly captures what was about to unfold. "I knew at that moment we were lost. The paratroopers were clearly marking flanks for a landing. Every minute we waited gave them time to consolidate. Yet we sat paralyzed by our own command structure." This wasn't von Luck being insubordinate or claiming he should have disobeyed orders. He understood that German military structure required coordination and centralized planning. But he also understood, in that moment before dawn on June 6, that this German approach to warfare, the careful coordination, the waiting for orders from above, the integration of different unit types into a unified plan was going to lose this battle. An army that could react in hours would eventually overwhelm an army that needed to coordinate and plan. The Allies could afford to be disorganized and confused because they had so much stuff that even disorganized confusion resulted in overwhelming force. Throughout the pre-dawn hours, as dawn approached, German observers in forward positions began reporting something that very few of them had ever seen before. Along the coast, offshore in the darkness, navigation lights on ships began to become visible. Then, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, something truly shocking became apparent. The horizon was no longer empty. It was covered with ships. Section 5. The Armada appears. Psychological devastation. What the German defenders witnessed in the dawnlight of June 6, 1944, had never been seen before in the history of warfare. The largest naval armada ever assembled in human history was offshore. The official Allied records list the composition:
1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary vessels, and 864 merchant ships. The total was 6,939 vessels. The water was literally covered from horizon to horizon with ships of every size and description. To modern eyes, looking at photographs taken that day, the crowding of ships is almost difficult to comprehend. They're literally packed together. There are massive battleships, sleek cruisers, destroyers, smaller frigates and corvettes, flat-topped aircraft carriers with their own complement of planes, and then, behind all the combat vessels, the transport ships, the LSTS and other landing ships that carried the troops and equipment. And beyond them, coming out of the morning haze, the landing craft themselves, carrying the assault troops toward the beaches. Many of these ships had crossed the channel overnight in force. The weather was indeed rough, stronger than the Allies would have preferred, with significant wave action. But it had been enough. A single day more in either direction, and the lunar and tidal conditions that were essential for the invasion wouldn't have aligned again for 2 weeks. The Allies had made their choice and sent the invasion fleet across. German soldiers who had been trained to believe in German superiority, who had been told repeatedly that democracy was weak and divided and incapable of sustained military effort, who had believed that American factories couldn't produce quality equipment in the quantities they claimed, were confronted with evidence that contradicted everything they'd been taught. This wasn't just a large force. This was something that transcended large. This was an armada of such scale that many German soldiers later reported that their minds simply couldn't process what they were seeing. It was too much. It was beyond the scale of anything in their experience. Bernhard Furking, an artillery officer at WN 62, later told his men that they were witnessing the whole world arriving on their doorstep. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech. Literally, the whole world seemed to be arriving. He would be killed later that day, but his observation captures the psychological shock that the defenders were experiencing. The reaction of German soldiers and officers varied. Some reached for weapons and prepared to fight. Others stood frozen, unable to quite comprehend what they were seeing. Some felt fear. Some felt resignation. Some felt anger. The range of human emotions under that kind of stress expressed itself in various ways. But the dominant emotion, the one that many survivors later reported, was a kind of shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. The wall was supposed to stop this. The guns were supposed to stop this. The orders they had trained to follow were supposed to be sufficient. They were catastrophically unprepared for the scale of what was about to hit them. Section 6. The naval bombardment and its unprecedented impact. The naval bombardment began as the first light of dawn broke across the channel. At approximately 5:30 in the morning on June 6, HMS Warspite, a British battleship with a distinguished history going back to the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, opened fire on German positions. She was the first Allied warship to fire on D-Day. She wasn't alone for long. Within minutes, other vessels began their bombardment. The USS Texas, a battleship that had spent much of the war in convoy escort duty and had never actually fired her main battery in combat before, began firing at the German artillery positions at Point du Hoc. The statistics are staggering. The USS Texas alone fired 255 14-inch shells in 34 minutes. That's a rate of fire of 7.5 shells per minute, sustained for more than half an hour. Each of those shells weighed nearly a ton. Each one was capable of destroying a building, devastating a bunker, killing dozens of men. HMS Warspite, in the first 2 days of the invasion, would deliver over 315-inch shells, including 96 rounds fired at German positions on June 9. When you consider that a single 15-inch or 14-inch shell is a devastating weapon, each one carrying hundreds of pounds of explosives, the cumulative effect of hundreds of such shells falling on a concentrated area becomes almost incomprehensible. This wasn't the only bombardment. Cruisers, destroyers, and smaller vessels joined in the fire. British, American, and Canadian warships pounded German positions. French warships added their guns. The Royal Norwegian Navy had a destroyer in the bombardment force. The cumulative naval firepower that could be brought to bear on the German defenses exceeded anything the Wehrdienst had previously encountered. The experience of the bombardment itself was something that many German survivors found almost impossible to articulate afterward.
How do you describe what it's like to sit in a bunker while massive naval shells are falling on and around you?
Contemporary accounts collected by various historians describe concrete bunkers designed to withstand any bombardment beginning to crack. Men were buried alive by shell concussions, dug out by their comrades, and then buried again as the bombardment continued. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Nothing in the experience of German soldiers, not even service on the Eastern Front, not even the heaviest RAF raids on German cities, had prepared them for this level of bombardment.
The Luftwaffe had dropped bombs, certainly.
Bombs fall from the sky and explode. But this was different. This was a continuous, coordinated, directed bombardment from huge guns. The shells came from ships that they couldn't reach, that their anti-aircraft guns couldn't hit, that their air force was incapable of defending against. The key thing about this bombardment was that it succeeded in one crucial way.
It suppressed the German defenses.
It didn't destroy all of them. Some German bunkers and gun positions survived and continued to function, but it disrupted them.
It killed men.
It destroyed communication wires. It neutralized artillery positions that had been carefully prepared over months or years. The German soldiers who survived the bombardment were, in many cases, psychologically shattered. They had just experienced what it felt like to be utterly helpless under a rain of explosives from a source they couldn't hit back at. Then, as the bombardment continued, German observers reported something else. The landing craft were coming.
Thousands of them. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands.
The first assault waves were heading for the beaches.
Section 7. The Luftwaffe's humiliation. As the invasion fleet approached the coast, German commanders naturally looked to the Luftwaffe for air support. The Luftwaffe, at various points in the war, had promised air superiority over any invasion. German fighter pilots had been among the best in the world at various points in the conflict. But by June 6, 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. The Luftwaffe had been devastated by years of attrition. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union meant the Air Force was stretched across two fronts. The American bombing campaign had systematically destroyed much of German aircraft production capacity and, more importantly, had killed enormous numbers of experienced German pilots. You can replace factories.
You can't replace pilots with 20 years of flying experience who have been killed in combat. The German Air Force, by 1944, had very few experienced pilots left, and the pilots they did have were increasingly worn out. On the morning of D-Day, the Luftwaffe was called upon to do the impossible. To provide air support against an invasion force that included thousands of Allied fighters and bombers. The response from the Luftwaffe was pathetic, not because the pilots and officers involved were cowardly or incompetent, but because the situation was simply hopeless. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jägerschwader 26, received orders to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His response, recorded in the war diary, captures the situation perfectly.
What entire force? I have 2 planes.
The Luftwaffe could only muster 319 sorties on D-Day against 14,674 Allied sorties.
The math is starkly clear.
The Allies had roughly a 47-1 advantage in air sorties. Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, actually did conduct the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches during the morning of June 6. They flew their FW-190A8 fighters toward Sword Beach and got off a single strafing run before overwhelming Allied fighter cover forced them to flee. This single strafing run by 2 aircraft against an invasion force of thousands became, in German histories, a kind of symbol. The promising knights of the air who were supposed to darken the skies over any invasion had been reduced to a futile gesture by a single pair of pilots. For the rest of the day, German air efforts were essentially non-existent. When German aircraft did manage to get airborne, they were quickly engaged and shot down.
The Luftwaffe's failure to provide any meaningful air support meant that German ground forces were operating without air cover against an enemy that had complete air superiority. Naval vessels could provide gunfire support to the Allies. German anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns could engage targets within their range.
But there was no German air support, no German aircraft to strafe the landing craft, no German bombers to attack the invasion fleet. This was something that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the war. In 1940, German air superiority had been so complete that it had been taken for granted. German soldiers had expected German planes in the sky. By 1944, the absence of German planes overhead, the complete and utter dominance of the sky by Allied fighters and bombers, was perhaps the most demoralizing thing for the troops on the ground.
Section 8. Omaha Beach and Machine Guns vs.
Industrial might. The story of D-Day from the German perspective cannot be told without focusing on what happened at Omaha Beach, where the American assault encountered the most vicious German resistance.
At 35 minutes past 6 in the morning on June 6, the first assault waves hit the beach. German defenders, despite the bombardment, manned their positions and opened fire. What followed was carnage that shocked even hardened veterans. Machine gunners opened up on the landing craft as they came ashore.
Mortar fire from positions inland rained down on men trying to cross the exposed beach. Artillery fire, coordinated from positions that had survived the bombardment, swept across the killing zone. The beach became something out of a nightmare. Bodies in the water, bodies on the sand, blood washing up with the waves. The casualty rate on Omaha that day would be approximately 2,400 Americans killed or wounded in the assault, making it one of the bloodiest beaches of the invasion. At position WN62, one of the strongest German defensive positions at Omaha, a young machine gunner began firing at 6:35 in the morning. His position was one of the few that had survived the bombardment intact. It commanded perfect fields of fire across the beach toward the sea. His weapon was an MG-42, one of the finest machine guns of the war, capable of firing at over 1,000 rounds per minute in short bursts. He would later claim in his memoir, published in 2005, that he fired 13,500 rounds over the course of 9 hours. While historians question the exact numbers and debate the specifics of his claims, what's certain is that machine gun positions like this one contributed significantly to the casualties at Omaha Beach. But here's the crucial thing that needs to be understood from the German perspective. No matter how many Americans fell, more appeared. Every destroyed landing craft was replaced by 3 more coming ashore. Every American soldier killed was replaced by another coming off the transports. Every silenced machine gun position was suppressed by naval gunfire that seemed unlimited. The Germans were experiencing what military historians would later term material shock, the mental breakdown caused by confronting such overwhelming force that no matter what you do, the outcome seems predetermined. By midday, German positions at Omaha and elsewhere began reporting critical ammunition shortages. The defensive plans had calculated ammunition expenditure based on repelling a limited assault. Nobody had planned for this scale of attack. The bunkers at Omaha were running out of ammunition for their machine guns. Artillery batteries were running low on shells. The Wehrmacht supply records would later show that positions that had ammunition calculated to last a 3-day battle exhausted their supplies within hours. What made this worse was that the Germans couldn't resupply. Every road leading to the front was under constant Allied fighter-bomber attack. German supply columns trying to push ammunition forward were strafed from the air. German trucks were destroyed. German soldiers were killed trying to deliver supplies. The contrast with Allied firepower was stark. American destroyers offshore would fire hundreds of shells at single targets. German artillery was rationed to 4 shells per gun per day by the afternoon of D-Day. The Germans were trying to conduct a modern war with supplies and ammunition appropriate for a pre-World War I conflict. Section 9. The command structure collapses. As D-Day unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the German command structure was incapable of responding effectively to the invasion. This wasn't because German commanders were stupid or incompetent. It was because the system itself was broken, and the situation was beyond what any command structure designed in peacetime could handle. Adolf Hitler slept late on the morning of June 6. Hitler kept the reserve panzer divisions, the armored forces that were supposed to be the hammer blow that would push the Allies back into the sea, under his direct personal control.
No one could move these tanks without his permission.
Various commanders recognized that the invasion had begun and that panzer units needed to be committed immediately. But they couldn't move without Hitler's authorization, and Hitler was asleep, and the people who were awake weren't about to wake him up. By the time Hitler woke up and made decisions about armor deployment, the critical hours of the invasion had passed. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant German armored unit close enough to the invasion beaches to affect the battle on D-Day, didn't receive orders to counterattack until 10 in the morning on June 6, 4 hours after the landings began. By that time, the Allies had thousands of men ashore and were consolidating their positions. The 21st Panzer Division did attack, advancing towards Sword and Juno beaches in the afternoon, and they actually reached the coast in some places. But by the time they got there, naval gunfire and British tanks and infantry were waiting for them. The 21st Panzer lost 70 out of 124 tanks on D-Day, losing about 25% of their strength in a single day.
They never broke through.
They never exploited any weakness in the Allied line. They simply bled themselves white and then withdrew.
Communication between different German units was breaking down.
Allied aircraft had systematically destroyed telephone lines. French resistance fighters, activated by coded BBC broadcasts, were cutting cables and destroying relay stations. German radio communications were being jammed by Allied electronic warfare units. General Lieutenant Max Pemmel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, was trying to coordinate the defense from headquarters at Lamar, but his war diary records increasing frustration as contact with forward units disappeared. By noon, entire divisions had vanished from the communication network. Individual unit commanders were making decisions in isolation without knowledge of the larger picture. This had a cascading effect.
Units that didn't know where neighboring units were didn't coordinate with them.
Commands that couldn't be communicated weren't obeyed.
Counterattacks that couldn't be coordinated failed.
The unified defense that German doctrine required was becoming impossible. The Germans had, in their defensive planning, assumed that the invasion would be a relatively limited affair that could be handled by coordinated action of defending units and counterattacking reserves. They had assumed that they would have time to concentrate forces. They had assumed that once they figured out where the main attack was, they could shift forces to meet it. But the Allies had turned the invasion into something that couldn't be handled by defense and counterattack. The sheer scale of the landing force, the overwhelming amount of supplies and reinforcements pouring ashore, the complete Allied air superiority, made traditional German military responses impossible.
Section 10.
Armor paralysis and failed counterattacks. The strategic problem facing the Germans on D-Day was actually relatively simple to understand, though incredibly difficult to solve.
The Germans needed to contain the Allied beachhead and prevent the Allies from building up their forces to the point where they became unstoppable.
This meant that German reserves needed to be committed quickly and decisively.
Rommel understood this.
He had argued for months that the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches or immediately afterward, before the Allies could consolidate. Once the Allies established a secure beachhead and began pouring supplies ashore, the war was lost not immediately, but eventually.
German reserves couldn't be replaced.
Allied reserves were essentially unlimited. But the command structure prevented this kind of response.
Armor had to be held under Hitler's control. Orders had to come through multiple layers of hierarchy.
By the time decisions were made and orders communicated, hours had passed.
And once those panzers did move, they moved into an environment that was utterly hostile to them.
As darkness fell on June 6, surviving German defenders took stock of their situation. The impregnable Atlantic Wall had been breached in multiple places. German positions at Omaha Beach were still holding, barely, and would hold through most of the day. But at Utah Beach, American forces had broken through relatively easily. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches had established substantial beachheads. By nightfall, the Germans had lost their main defensive line.
More important than any single position was the overall situation. The Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force over Normandy.
German naval forces, the Kriegsmarine, had managed to sink one destroyer, the USS Corrie, while losing 15 E-boats, and numerous smaller craft had been roughly handled and driven away from the invasion fleet. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Division that had borne the brunt of the British assault, reported to 7th Army Headquarters. Division combat strength 35%. All coastal strong points lost. Artillery 90% destroyed. Enemy advancing inland. The statistics from June 6 alone told a story of complete tactical failure. German forces had suffered casualties equivalent to those of a major battle, and the Allies continued landing fresh troops as if D-Day was merely the beginning, not the climax. Section 11. The collapse of confidence and impossible mathematics. Throughout the night of June 6 to June 7, German units attempted to regroup and counterattack. These efforts revealed the full extent of Allied superiority. Every German movement was detected by radar. Units attempting to move were illuminated by parachute flares dropped from Allied aircraft and were destroyed by artillery or naval gunfire. Hans von Luck's Panzer Grenadiers, finally released to counterattack, advanced toward Sword Beach in darkness. According to his memoir, they were immediately illuminated by parachute flares, and then subjected to devastating fire from destroyers offshore. It was like daylight, he wrote. Every vehicle, every soldier was visible. The shells came from the sea with perfect accuracy. They lost half their strength without seeing a single enemy soldier. The fundamental problem was that German military thinking, German defensive doctrine, German concepts of warfare, were based on assumptions that were no longer valid. German doctrine called for a threefold approach. Mobile defense in depth, backed by local striking power to hold the Allies in check, followed by bringing a mobile strategic reserve to bear for a decisive counterattack and battle of annihilation. This doctrine had worked in 1940 against the French. It had worked, to a degree, against the Soviets, though on a much bigger scale. But it couldn't work against an enemy that had essentially unlimited logistics. German supply lines were being interdicted. The Luftwaffe was gone, so there was no air cover for German movements. Allied aircraft ranged freely over the roads, railways, and bridges of Normandy, attacking everything that moved. The German 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse, received orders to move to Normandy. The journey should have taken 3 days. It took 17 days. They arrived having lost 30% of their vehicles to air attack without firing a shot at ground forces. Meanwhile, Allied logistics operated with stunning efficiency. Whilst landing ship tanks were discharging entire armored regiments in hours. Within days of D-Day, the Allies were landing 15,000 tons of supplies daily, more than the entire German army in Normandy consumed in a week. The Allies were literally overwhelming the Germans with stuff. Not just soldiers, not just weapons, but supplies. Ammunition, food, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, everything an army needed to operate. The sheer volume of supplies coming ashore made it impossible for the Germans to maintain supply shortages that might have limited Allied operations. By June 12, German forces in Normandy were approaching psychological collapse. They had lost 26,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, roughly equivalent to 2 full divisions. Replacements were minimal. Meanwhile, Allied strength grew hourly. Fresh divisions landed. Fresh armor came ashore. Fresh aircraft arrived at makeshift airfields behind the lines. Corentin fell on June 12, linking Utah and Omaha beaches. The German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite troops who had never previously retreated, withdrew in disorder. Their commander, Friedrich Fonder, reported to higher headquarters. "My regiment no longer exists as a combat unit. The survivors are psychologically broken." Section 12. The mathematics of defeat and lasting legacy. The mathematics of defeat were being written in statistics that no German general wanted to read. Normandy, from the German perspective, was an unfolding catastrophe that accelerated day by day. By June 26, the port city of Cherbourg, supposedly garrisoned by 21,000 men and fortified over 4 years, fell in 5 days. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schleben, commanding the garrison, had proclaimed he would defend Cherbourg to the last bullet.
Instead, he surrendered. In his post-war interrogation, he explained that resistance became meaningless against unlimited enemy resources.
Operation Cobra, beginning July 25, delivered what amounted to the knockout punch to German forces in Normandy. The preparatory bombardment involved 1,530 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers, dropping over 4,100 tons of bombs in a concentrated area just 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. One of the casualties was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, who was observing from what he thought was a safe distance.
If American generals weren't safe from their own firepower, what chance did German soldiers have? The Falaise Pocket, between August 12 and 21, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy.
Approximately 10,000 Germans died in the pocket and 50,000 were captured.
Over 300 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed. 2,500 other vehicles were lost.
German soldiers attempting to escape described scenes of apocalyptic destruction, roads carpeted with dead horses and burning vehicles, Allied fighter bombers attacking in waves every 20 minutes, artillery falling continuously. The systematic destruction was so complete that many soldiers simply gave up, preferring captivity to certain death. The final accounting of the Normandy campaign, from June 6 to August 31, tells a story of complete German defeat.
Approximately 320,000 German casualties. 30,000 killed. 80,000 wounded. 210,000 missing or captured. 2,300 tanks destroyed, virtually all armor in France. 2,127 aircraft lost. By contrast, Allied losses were 29,672 casualties, but replacements exceeded losses daily. Approximately 4,000 tanks lost but replaced within weeks. 4,011 aircraft lost from a force exceeding 13,000. The disparity was staggering. Germany was fighting a war it could not win against an enemy with essentially unlimited reserves. Professional German military officers, the men who had commanded armies and now faced the ruins of their commands, provided the most objective assessments of the disaster. General Diensttruppen Heinrich Abbebach, who assumed command in Normandy after Rommel was wounded, reported to Hitler's headquarters on August 1. The enemy's material superiority is at least 20-1 in artillery, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute in aircraft. He can replace all losses within days. We cannot replace anything. General Hanspeidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in his 1949 memoir. Normandy proved that courage alone could not overcome industrial supremacy. We faced an enemy who had mechanized not just warfare, but victory itself. Field Marshal Owen Rommel himself left the most powerful testimony to the Normandy experience. In his final report to Hitler on July 15, just 2 days before being severely wounded by Allied aircraft, Rommel wrote, "The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material is beginning to tell. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay." This was military language for complete defeat. Rommel, Germany's most celebrated commander, was telling Hitler that the war was lost. The Normandy campaign revealed that World War II had become a production war. German soldiers witnessed American industrial capacity that defied comprehension. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Allied ammunition expenditure in a single day exceeded German production in a month. A single American division consumed more supplies daily than an entire German corps. Hans von Luck, reflecting on Normandy in his memoir, wrote, "We learned that modern war was not about tactics or courage, but about production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial process. They manufactured victory on assembly lines." The German soldiers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed. They had witnessed the complete invalidation of everything they had been taught about warfare, racial superiority, and national destiny. Heinrich So, the machine gunner at WN-62, spent the rest of his life haunted by his D-Day experience.
In his 2005 memoir, he wrote about meeting American D-Day veterans.
"We all realized we had been young men thrown into an industrial slaughterhouse.
My 13,500 rounds meant nothing against their unlimited replacements." Friedrich Fonder, the paratrooper commander, became a professor of international law after the war. He wrote, "Normandy taught us that the era of warrior heroes was over. War had become a matter of industrial capacity, and we had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with horses and outdated dreams."
D-Day from the German perspective was not merely a military defeat. It was a complete ideological and psychological collapse.
Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe discovered that everything they believed about their enemies, their cause, and their capabilities was catastrophically wrong. They had expected to face weak, divided democracies.
Instead, they encountered an alliance that had transformed war into an industrial process of overwhelming efficiency.
They witnessed democracy's arsenal in action: unlimited ships, planes, tanks, and supplies flowing from factories whose capacity exceeded German comprehension. The German defenders of Normandy learned that modern war was won not on battlefields, but in factories. Not by the bravest soldiers, but by the most productive societies. They discovered that the Western Allies had revolutionized warfare, turning it into a mathematical equation where production statistics mattered more than tactical brilliance.
Heinrich so began June 6, 1944, believing the invasion would be thrown back within hours.
He ended it surrounded by thousands of empty shell casings, his gun barrel warped from heat, watching endless waves of Allied reinforcements land on the beaches position was supposed to control.
His experience embodied the larger German tragedy in Normandy. Tactical success drowned in strategic impossibility.
The beaches of Normandy became not just a battlefield, but a revelation. German soldiers witnessed the future of warfare, and it belonged to the societies that could produce the most material and apply it most efficiently. They had brought courage, training, and determination to the battle. The Allies brought unlimited industrial production. In trying to hold back the Allied invasion, the German defenders might as well have been trying to hold back the tide itself. They fired until their barrels melted, fought until their ammunition ran out, and watched as the Allies simply brought more of everything. The mathematics of modern war had rendered their courage irrelevant. The German soldiers who faced D-Day learned history's hardest lesson. In the age of industrial warfare, nations that could not match their enemies' production were doomed to defeat regardless of their soldiers' skill or sacrifice. They began June 6 as warriors of the Third Reich and ended it as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy in its full terrifying efficiency. Their defeat was not just military but taught a crushing demonstration that the Nazi vision of racial superiority and military dominance had collided with the reality of Allied industrial supremacy and shattered completely. The invasion they had promised to throw back into the sea had instead swept them away, carrying with it the last illusions of German victory. The story of D-Day from the German perspective is the story of the moment when the old world of warfare based on tactics, courage, and military skill collided with the new world of industrial warfare. And the old world, for all its tradition and all its courage, was simply crushed beneath the weight of unlimited supplies, unlimited reinforcements, and unlimited production. That's the story from the front lines of World War II. If this history has captivated you, the clash of empires, the strategy behind the battlefields, and the personal stories of ordinary soldiers, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless stories from the war that deserve to be told, and we are committed to bringing you the most compelling, well-researched narratives.
Thank you for watching WWII Frontline.